Hey everybody, in this video today, let's have a look at settings specific to landscape photography. I think without a doubt, the most popular question I've been asked over the years would be, what were the settings? What settings did you use in this image? I don't really like answering that question all the time because the settings used in one scenario at a certain place at a certain time could be completely different at a different location, or even the same location but with different lighting. So really, if you knew the settings for a certain photo, it doesn't mean that you can put those settings in and go elsewhere and get the same result, because there's quite a few factors to look at: the depth of field, what is the light doing at the time, etc. So hopefully we'll go through a few images now. We'll look at the settings used, but I'll explain why I use them and then what I'm typically trying to do generally across the board with my images in regards to settings itself. So hopefully by the end of this you get a better overview of a ballpark of what settings you might want to be in for landscape photography to achieve certain results. So before we start looking at the images, there's a couple of specific things I'm always trying to achieve in my images. The first one is low noise. I want to have high detail in my images with the least amount of noise as possible. The other thing as well is sharpness. I really like to have sharp detail from front to back in all of my work. Let's say, for example, if you're a portrait photographer, it's very common and effective to say blur the background and get bokeh, have a shallow depth of field. With my landscape images, and people do that in landscape photography too, but for me, I like to have that clarity from front to back. Everything is actually in focus. So if we choose to look at details somewhere in the frame, whether it's down in the far left corner or up in the top right corner in the distance, it's actually going to be sharp and nothing is out of focus. So I'm having an extreme depth of field. Just like in the real world, if we choose to look at something, we can admire the details and it's sharp. They're kind of the two main things I'm looking at. That's what I want to do. I also like to not have details lost in the shadows or highlights. So I'm trying to retain all the details and not blowing out the highlights or underexposing the shadows. So they're the three things. I'm trying to get the optimal image quality possible. So if I printed this really large, it's still going to look great. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward now and look at some of the images. The big question, so we'll look at this winter image here. So I'm in Adobe Bridge, and down the bottom you can see the metadata. So this is my settings here used: f11, 1/30th of a second, and then ISO 100. For me, really, the first thing you need to ask yourself when it comes to settings in landscape photography, I like to often consider the depth of field, and I'm asking myself, okay, how much depth do I have in this scene? Because that's going to dictate where I go on that f-stop. If you don't understand the exposure triangle, ISO, aperture, shutter speed, we're not going to deep dive into those today. I cover that in other videos, in some courses and things. Jump on YouTube if you need to. So we're not going to deep dive into the exposure triangle itself, but I'm obviously going to be referring to those terms a lot, and we will obviously delve into it partially. But if you're unfamiliar at all with those, maybe pause now and then come back briefly once you've got your head around it. So I asked myself, how much depth of field do I have? So people often get confused about depth of field and just depth in general. What I like to do to explain it is basically I'm saying, where is that first subject matter in proximity to me? So for example, in this image here, the first subject matter is really this snowgrass down at the bottom of the frame. If that is, let's say, 20 feet away from me, then basically everything in the frame, including the mountain, the sky, and that snowgrass, is quite far away from myself. If it's 20 feet for the first subject matter and then everything's further from there, that's quite far away. And to the lens, there's actually not much depth there. It starts to become like a shallow plane, like a flat plane, if that makes sense. If I got ultra close, which is somewhat what I've actually done in this image, so that snowgrass is literally, let's say, 3 feet in front of me. That is very close to the lens. And then of course the mountains in the background are far away. That is a big depth of field. If I'm having a big depth of field like that, and I have a lot of depth in the frame, I will close down the f-stop. So I'm going to be shooting at a narrow aperture. And in this shot you can see I've used f11. f11 is my go-to aperture. At that point, we're still quite sharp on the lens optically. If we close right down to say f22, the optical performance of the lens suffers because that aperture blade is closing down so much. So you can look that up if you've never heard of that before. But f11 is that point of compromise where we're getting typically enough depth of field and we're staying sharp. If I went to say f9, you find that it's a little bit too shallow. You won't quite cover enough ground. The only way to know is to shoot and then assess the image on the back of your camera. Zoom in, is it sharp at the bottom, sharp in the background, move on. If it's not, adjust, close the f-stop down, adjust accordingly. The ISO I keep low, so my native ISO on the camera is 100. That's typically where I'd like to be. If I need to go to 200, no worries, very minimal, hardly noticeable difference at all. But then as we start going up from there, it starts to get more noticeable. So 95% of my images are ISO 200 or 100. That's typically where I'll float. Lastly is the shutter speed. I'm handheld all the time, so I'm a bit weary of the shutter speed. If I go too slow, then I'm going to get a blurry photo. It's just how it is. So that's why a tripod comes in handy. For me, as I've mentioned before, I can shoot quite slow handheld because of that stabilization on my camera, particularly when I'm wider. So the wider we are, the slower we can go. A good guideline, and this is a guideline which I break, but a good guideline is whatever your focal length is, try and match that with your shutter speed or be even faster. For example, if you're at 20 mil, quite wide, you want to be 1/20th or faster, 1/20th, 30, 50, etc. If you're at 100 mil zoomed in, you want to be 1/100th of a second or faster. That's a guideline to make sure that that small shake in your hand won't blur the image. Now with the IBIS on the camera, the mirrorless camera here, I definitely break that rule. I'm quite comfortable at say 16 mil shooting 1/5, 1/6 of a second, and that's how I get those slow shutter effects. Obviously I'm nice and calm. I might be sitting or resting on something, but you can definitely break it. So that's another thing I'm keeping in mind with the shutter speed is, what's my focal length? How slow can I go? If it's getting to a point where it's so dark and I need to be quite slow, then I'll look at boosting the ISO partially and also lowering the f-stop to help get the exposure bright enough. So let's look at a few more examples there. So you see this one, f11, it's given me that depth of field, sharp all the way through. 30th of a second at 16 mil, no worries. Definitely fast enough. And then ISO 100, so I know I've got that complete dynamic range and low noise in the file itself. So we'll move on. Let's look at a different example here. A bird in flight, the Kia. He landed in the tree and I was hoping that he would take off again. So I quickly adjusted my settings in anticipation for that. A moving object, you need a fast shutter speed if you want to freeze it. So I went to 1,250th of a second, so 1,250 of a second on the shutter speed, nice and quick to freeze the movement of the bird. f11, why did I stay on f11? I wanted to be sharp on the bird as well as the mountain in the back, plus the foreground. I didn't want this to be a wildlife photo, I wanted it to be a landscape with wildlife in it, so still sharp front to back. But of course, with a fast shutter speed like that, I'm not letting much light in. f11 is a narrow aperture, it's not letting much light in either. So what did I have to do? I had to boost the ISO this time to 640. Now 640 is still quite clean on my camera, and that's a little bit of a threshold for me. Once I start going above that, I'm really not personally happy with the noise. But I went straight to it because I knew that, alright, no point sitting at 400 or 500. The results at 640 are comparable to 400 and 500 anyway, so I went straight there, and then I dialed in those other settings and waited for the bird to take off. So this is a scenario again, I've got that depth of field, the shutter speed was specific for the movement this time, and then the ISO had to come up to compensate. This scene here is on the telephoto. I've zoomed in, and there is actually some depth here in the sense that although the first tree is not that close to me, when you're on the telephoto lens now, if you're zooming on something, the first subject matter, which in this case is the green branch on the right hand side, if you're zooming on the telephoto lens, the distance between that and whatever's behind it, the telly will really give you a shallow depth of field. It'll accentuate the distance between them. So we get that cool compression with the telephoto lens where it can pull everything and make it look closer. But you will if you are getting something relatively close in the frame, like I have with this tree, you're still going to get that big depth of field going on, as opposed to an aerial, which we'll get to in a minute. So just keeping that in mind, that's why I've gone f16 now on the lens, to really make sure I'll sharp not only on the front trees, but also the ones in the back. 500th of a second. That was nice and fast because I was on the long lens around 300mm from memory, so zoomed in a lot. So I want to make sure that, because I'm zoomed in really far, that shake in my hand isn't going to give me a blurry shot. And then I've thrown it on ISO 200 just to give that little bit brighter exposure, because I was having a fast shutter speed and a narrow aperture. With an aerial image now, this is all far away. This is around, let's say 50mm approximately. Far away. Now, do we have a big depth of field? In theory, you know, we've got a mountain here which is maybe half a mile from me, and then the end of the fjord here is 3 miles away. Yeah, we've got a huge depth of field. However, there's huge depth, but as far as depth of field goes, I didn't really need f11 or f16, because that first subject matter, remember, like I said on that first one with the snowgrass, the first point of detail in the shot is so far from me. And I'm not zoomed in ultra tight, I'm only around 50mm for argument's sake. So to the lens, whether it's the front of the first mountain here or the end of the fjord, it's all the same almost to the lens. You could shoot this at, say, f4, f7, f11, it's going to be sharp all the way through, because all the subject matter is far away. We're not zooming in crazy around 300-400mm and getting some ultra compression. So it's all far away. It's all okay to leave a wide aperture if you have to. So this is an aerial, which means I shot at 800th of a second to compensate for the plane just soaring by. So we're going quite quick in the plane, so I've got movement involved. ISO 200, just like I said before, it's just giving me that bright exposure without adding too much noise, so that's fine. And then I've sat on f8. Why did I do f8 and not say f4 or f11? Most lenses are going to be sharpest around that f7, 8, 9 mark. There's no point. I've got the shutter speed I need. 800 was well and truly fast enough for the movement here, because again, it was all far away, so the movement wasn't too fast and pronounced. So 800 was fine. I'm happy if ISO 200. So I'm just looking at my histogram through my viewfinder, and then I just sat around that f-stop that was going to give me a nice result and not blow out the highlights in the sky. You know, when you're in a wide angle, you're really thinking about the depth of field when you've got something right in front of you, right in the back. When it's something like this where it's all far away, you can get that same result with a variety of settings. We could have been f4 2000th of a second and the image would look the same. We could have been ISO 100, so made it a little bit darker, slowed the shutter down to maybe 500, that got things a bit brighter, bang, get the same result practically. So when it's all far away, you have a little bit more margin for error, but when it's ultra close, something like this one here, it's going to make a huge difference if that f-stop isn't just right, because you're not going to get the clarity all the way through. You're going to get soft areas in the frame. So f14 here for the massive depth of field, 1/10 of a second, so getting very slow on the shutter speed. It's a dark environment, even though the sunlight was coming in, it's all backlit, lots of shadows that I've had to recover. And then ISO 640 again, because it is a dark environment, so I've boosted that there in order to make sure that I wasn't taking home files that were incredibly underexposed. So huge depth of field, because that fern is literally just a foot in front of me. So if I focused on that, I'm going to be blurry in the background if that f-stop wasn't narrow enough. Now in this image as well, I've done what's called a focus stack, because even at f14, because I'm so ultra close to that first subject matter, it doesn't matter if I'm on f14, f16, f18, if I'm focusing on that lower portion of the fern down the bottom, it's going to be blurry in the back. The lens just physically can't achieve that extreme depth of field when that first point of focus is very close. So for that reason, I focused right on the lower portion, took the exposure, and then immediately after refocused into the background, took the second one, both at f14, so they've still got a big overlap of depth of field, And then in the computer, we piece it together to get sharp from front to back. So that's the extreme end of things that we might have to do sometimes. Let's look at two more examples. This one here, it's all far away. It's on the long lens, around 100 millimeters. It's a flat scene. There's not much depth here, even though in theory the lower left would be some distance from the far right because it's slowly angled, so there's a bit of distance there. But to the lens, it's all far away. It's all a kilometre away from me as the photographer. So the depth of field didn't matter too much. So I've thrown it on f9, 1/100th of a second, fast enough for the stabilised body at 100mm, no worries at all. And then ISO 100 to have the low noise. So you just need to quickly ask yourself, alright, where is that first detail, that point of interest? What is the f-stop that I'll need? For me, the ISO is a no-brainer. I'm just often leaving that low, 100 to 200. Very rarely will have to go above that. So you can stop thinking about the ISO so much. You're often just juggling the other two, the f-stop and the shutter speed, and adjusting those accordingly. Here's some nice trees covered in morning light and fresh snow, all far away from me again, so I'm zoomed in, 100 ISO, 1/100th of a second, f7, no problem at all. And that's got all this scene sharp, and then there's clarity in the background as well. Would slightly drop off towards the back here just to showcase that depth. But again, f7, because it's all far away on the side of a mountain, the lens more or less just renders it as the same. It can't pick up that there's really distance between these trees in these backgrounds. Unless I zoomed in incredibly extreme, as I mentioned earlier, then I might have to close the f-stop down to f16 or something like we did on those other tree ones. Here's a big grand scene now, and quite some depth of field here because these trees were 2 feet in front of me. So relatively close, not extremely close, but close enough. So I've gone to f14, make sure I've got that detail all the way through, 1/80th of a second, ISO 100. Now, if I did this at say f16, you're probably barely going to notice a difference. There'll be a slight subtle exposure difference in the raw file, but in the computer we could just brighten it up anyway. If it was say f13, probably wouldn't notice a difference either. So what I'm getting at is, on these wide scenes, if you're not extremely close to that foreground matter, if it's 2 feet and beyond, the differences between f11, 13, 14, 16 are negligible. You're barely going to notice. So sometimes you might just end up on that point just as a safety, or you just, instead of being at f11, I just said, oh, you know what, I'm just going to really make sure I cover my ground here, throw it on f14. So it's not that critical. And that's one thing I remember when I was starting out. I just wanted to know what was the optimal f-stop to use, but it just really does depend on the scenario you're shooting. Here's another example. f5 now. Now, look at the depth of field. Is there a distance between a mountain and the moon? Yeah, there's a few light years between the two. Why am I at f5? Again, these mountains are so far in the distance that whether I focused on them or the moon, it was irrelevant to the lens. They were both at what you'd call the infinity point, far off in the distance. So I've used f5 there. I would prefer to be at f8 or f9 to get that optimal clarity on the lens. But this was extreme low light. The sun is set, the moon's rising, and I needed a fast shutter speed because this is an aerial perspective. So I've had to sit on 5/100th of a second, boosted the ISO up to 250 because of the low light, and then the f5 was the widest I could go on the aperture. So I wanted to let light in. I'm letting light in with the f-stop here. It's not about depth of field. It's irrelevant. It's about letting light in. So that would typically happen in an aerial type scenario or a telephoto scenario where you're shooting something far away, which is often on aerials as well. So that's why I've done that there. Let's do one more, hey? Something a little bit different perhaps. Another one again. Aerial perspective, f7, 12/50 of a second, nice and fast, ISO 200, so it's really bright here. We've got all that light reflecting off the snow. Why f7? I think you know the answer. It's a telephoto shot. This front ridge, although there's a big depth between this and the mountain in the back, they're all so far away from me that it's just flat to the lens. It's a flat scene. The lens isn't determining the distance between the two, so we could just go with that wide aperture. Lucky last. Another aerial, wide angle this time, f5.6, 400th of a second, nice and quick because I'm hovering in the air. Make sure I didn't get any movement, blurriness. 200 ISO, keep that noise low and make sure I'm maintaining that dynamic range. 5.6 is where I ended up in order to get the correct exposure, allowing me to maintain that fast shutter speed. Because I'm not ultra close to anything, the trees are technically the closest thing to me here. They're still far away. So you guessed it, it almost doesn't matter whether I'm at f4, 5.6, f7. So really, I like to think of it, if you're going to break it down with settings, noise, ISO, let's keep it low. Bump it up as a last resort. Night photography, you have to, maybe you're in a forest, you don't have a tripod like I was in those ones, you have to bump it up a little bit. Ask yourself the question now, how close am I to the first subject matter? What is the depth in this shot? What depth of field do I need? Is that first object a foot in front of me? Yes, now we're close. Huge depth of field, f11, f16, etc. Is it a few feet and beyond with everything else? That's getting further away. You might be okay at f9, f8. If it's 20 feet and beyond, it's all far away, like this shot here, then sure, f4, 5.6, it almost doesn't matter now. The lens will not determine the distance between that tree and that tree, that valley, if it's all far away. Unless you're on a telephoto lens, you're zooming in like crazy, you're going to create that depth of field then. But typically, if you're a bit wider, everything's far away, it's a flat field of view to the lens. That's why I say night photography. In night photography, 90% of the time, we're using a wide aperture to help let light in and get a bright exposure. To do that, you might be on an f2.8 lens and shooting at f2.8. You'll notice a lot of astro photos, people don't have much of a foreground because they can't get the depth of field, they can't get the image sharp at f2.8. So a lot of astro shots, it'll be something in the distance for the subject, like a mountain or a tree, and then the stars. There's a big difference between the distance from the tree to the stars, but because it's all far away from the lens, you can do it at 2.8, you're sharp all the way through. Once you start incorporating elements getting closer to you, the photographer, now you're going to need to close the f-stop down, and that's where people might shoot that in the blue hour before the stars are out. Shoot it on f11 or 16, wait till it gets dark, shoot the stars, and then in processing you can put it in. Or you can do it all at nighttime at 2.8, but you have to take multiple shots, multiple exposures, and do a focus stack. So there's different hacks that we have to get around the technical limitations of the lens, for example. So start to ask yourself those questions, really. ISO, it's a no-brainer. We don't want it higher, leave it low. F-stop and shutter speed. How much depth do I have? And then with the shutter speed, what focal length am I at? What's my shutter speed? If you're getting below what your focal length is, so if you're at 100 mil and you're sitting on 50th of a second, don't panic and go, oh no, I better speed it up. Just take a shot and check, and it might be sharp anyway, particularly if the body or lens is stabilized. If it's coming out blurry, then you might need to speed the shutter up, might have to get a tripod or something like that for argument's sake, but hopefully you'll be able to get around it like I've managed to do. Okay, I hope that helps you. You'll see that every scenario is different. It depends what the light's doing as well. How much light do we have to work with? What's your focal length? It's not really a straightforward answer, unfortunately, but I just hope this has given you a bit of an overview of the way that I approach things, but also what to look for out in the field and how to get those sharp images from front to back. And as always, the very best thing you can do for yourself is just practice. Practice, practice, practice. And the fun thing with settings and, let's say, depth of field, for example, you don't have to be at an amazing location. Just go outside in your backyard and start to play with getting something in the foreground, something in the background, adjust the f-stop, have a look at how the clarity increases or decreases, step further back, try it again, and then hopefully it all starts to tie in and make a little more sense to you. Once you start to grasp this, it is so much more enjoyable, your photography, because you're not thinking about it. It becomes almost subconscious, and then your creativity can just really come through then. So thanks for viewing. I hope that helped. Any questions, just let me know. I'll see you in the next video.